About 60 years ago, in 1963, when I went to junior college in the first, one of the first law enforcement programs, 2-year programs, and I was the part of the campus police at the junior college, and I graduated from that 2-year program in '65. After that, I went to Vietnam, and I worked with the Vietnamese National Police and the CIA. In Vietnam, unusual assignment, which I talked about here a couple months ago. After Vietnam, I was a Sonoma County Deputy Sheriff in California, and with the District Attorney's Office. After that, in 1981, I went to join the Postal Inspection Service. All of this was all federal and local law enforcement. And then actually, after I retired from the postal inspectors, I worked for Netflix for 5 years and worked with the postal inspectors to have them arrest people stealing Netflix DVDs. So my career goes back 60 years ago with 50 years of service. The UniBomber case was unique, and the titled Unibomber has to do with university and airline bombs. So that's why it's called Unibomber. So there'll be a little introduction video here.
Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unibomber, was a domestic terrorist who targeted universities and airlines in a bombing spree that lasted nearly 2 decades. Born in 1942 in Chicago, Illinois, Kaczynski was a highly intelligent and talented individual who showed promise from a young age. Kaczynski was a bright student and excelled academically, eventually earning a PhD in mathematics from the University of Michigan. He went on to hold a faculty position at the University of California, Berkeley, where he taught mathematics. However, despite his early success, Kaczynski eventually dropped out of academia and retreated to a remote cabin in Montana. It was there that Kaczynski transformed into the Unibomber, a radical anti-technology activist who sought to strike back at a society he perceived as being controlled by technology. He believed that it was destroying humanity and sought to bring attention to this issue by targeting universities and airlines with bombs. Kaczynski's manifesto, which he sent to several newspapers, outlined his views on technology and his motivations for the bombings. In it, he argued that technology was not only destroying the environment and eroding human freedom, but also threatening to turn humans into little more than cogs in a machine-driven society. Despite his efforts to bring attention to his beliefs, Kaczynski's actions were widely condemned as reprehensible and harmful. Nevertheless, his case continues to raise important questions about the dangers of technology and the limits of individual freedom in modern society. Kaczynski's bombing campaign as the Unibomber lasted nearly 2 decades, from 1978 to 1995, during which he targeted universities and airlines. Over the course of this campaign, he injured 23 people and killed 3 others with his homemade bombs. The Unibomber's methods were highly sophisticated, and he took great care to ensure that his bombs would cause the maximum amount of damage. His bombs were designed to be detonated by remote control or when opened by the intended victim. The bombings were the subject of intense investigation by the FBI, who eventually were able to track him down using forensic evidence and the help of Kaczynski's own brother. Despite his efforts to remain anonymous, Kaczynski was eventually arrested and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The investigation and capture were a complex and multifaceted effort that lasted nearly 2 decades. The FBI led the investigation, and its efforts were extensive. Agents used a variety of techniques, including forensic analysis and eyewitness accounts, to try and track down the bomber. Despite these efforts, Kaczynski managed to remain at large for many years. However, a major break in the case came when Kaczynski sent his manifesto to several newspapers, including the Washington Post. In the manifesto, he outlined his motivations for the bombings and his anti-technology beliefs. The publication of the manifesto was crucial in the investigation, as it provided insight into the Unibomber's mindset and helped the FBI to develop a profile of the suspect. One of the key factors in Kaczynski's capture was the role played by his own brother, David Kaczynski. After recognizing similarities between the Unibomber's manifesto and Ted's writing, David contacted the FBI and provided them with crucial information about his brother's whereabouts and activities. Based on this information, the FBI was able to track down Kaczynski to his remote cabin in Montana. He was arrested without incident and eventually convicted on multiple charges, including the use of weapons of mass destruction. Kaczynski was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His capture marked the end of a long and complex investigation, and it stands as a testament to the FBI's determination and expertise. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch.
Okay. Are there any FBI agents in here? Or retired FBI? How about local law enforcement? Anybody worked in law enforcement? Okay. You saw the video. The FBI did everything right to solve this case. I'm here to tell you that they didn't solve the case. A task force of inspectors and postal inspectors and FBI agents and ATF agents and local law enforcement arrested the Unibomber. All the other agencies were kind of left out of the recognition in both the movies and the books. Although the book does recognize the inspection service, that the main book that was written about the Unibomber was written by the SAC in charge of the San Francisco field office for the FBI, and my boss was a part of the hierarchy and the management of the Unibomber case. So postal inspectors and FBI agents worked together for 5 years full-time on that case. The postal inspectors assigned 10 inspectors full-time, and then San Francisco PD, Sacramento PD had people on the task force as well. So it kind of irritates me every time I see that video that talks about the FBI solving the case. So that's my thing. And as a postal inspector, I retired 20 years ago. But I still say we when I refer to the Postal Service. We have a carrier here, so I want to, I assume he may do the same thing. Ben Franklin was the person who founded the Postal Inspection Service in 1775, so we claim to be the oldest law enforcement agency. Our responsibilities were to investigate and protect and audit the post office. We did crimes against anything. There's like 68 federal crimes that deal with the post office. Many of them are fraud and stamps, counterfeit. We do investigations of fraud, embezzlement by postal employees from our postal service, and then other employee crimes, drugs in the mail, workers' compensation fraud, stealing mail. Bombs in the mail is our highest priority. It's what we call prohibited mails. It actually included alcohol, but mainly bombs in the mail is our top priority. Our mission was to identify and apprehend people and IEDs. IEDs become, at the time we were doing this investigation, we didn't even call devices in Vietnam IEDs, we call them booby traps, but that IEDs is now the terminology that's used for explosive devices, especially after Iraq and guys that had to deal with the devices there and the terrible injuries that bombs cause. Mailing a bomb is, at the time we did this investigation, was a death penalty case. It could be life in prison, but if a death occurred, a murder, it had death penalty. And ultimately, when the Unibomber was arrested, Janet Reno authorized the death penalty for him if he was convicted. We'll hear a little bit more about that later. characteristics of letter bombs and package bombs. A letter bomb is kind of an interesting thing. This is a letter bomb. A letter bomb has to have something inside to cause a detonation, and usually it's a blasting cap or some other improvised device. So I'll pass this around, but when you think of letters, this letter is unusual because it's got a bunch of something inside that you can feel, and it makes it suspicious if you were to receive it. These are facsimiles of the Unibomber's devices. You'll see when I go through the presentation that even though there's an explosion from these packages, it didn't blow up the package. Quite often when the device detonated, it just blew the package away and the bomb went, it detonated, or didn't detonate and created a flare kind of situation, which we'll talk about also. Most of the devices that the Unibomber used were pipe bombs, and many of them were made out of copper, half-inch and 3/4-inch copper. And we'll talk about this also because these are not quite as severe as a metal steel pipe with screwed caps on, which are, if they detonate, sends a lot more shrapnel. When the copper detonates, it just splits the copper and it doesn't fragment it. So anything inside would go with the explosive inside, but it would just split the pipe, and we would end up recovering the pipe. So they're not quite as severe, and he learned over time, the Unibomber did, that each bomb got a little better and a little. So I'll pass these around as well, and we'll be talking about them off and on. So these are similar. They're just. And then the final bomb that we'll talk about later is this device. This is the 16th device, a facsimile of it, and it's unique in. As it's passed to you, you'll find out what's unique about it.
It's coming early.
So that's the beginning, and these are the things that we look for in a suspicious device. Mainly, they usually have a lot of postage on them, and it's usually stamps because the suspect doesn't want to go into the post office where we have photographs being taken and record that he's delivering a bomb to the post office. So usually they put stamps on, and they put more stamps than what's necessary. The devices have to be small enough to fit inside the collection box. After the Unibomber case, the Postal Service changed its policy, and anything over a pound you had to take to the post office. So you're probably experiencing that now. Other things like a strange odor, like gasoline or oily stains. In this one of the small envelopes, look at the sealing of the envelope, and right in one portion you'll see some wire sticking out of one of the devices I sent, one of the envelope devices. If you look at the flap, you can lift the flap up and see the wire. So if you were to receive something that you didn't expect and it's unusual, these are kind of indicators, and not all these things are on every device, but these are the common things that we come across. In the Unibomber case, we had 7 mailed devices, 9 bombs were placed, and you can see the jurisdiction of each of the types. Mailed bombs, FBI can be involved. They weren't involved in most of the mailings. Placed devices is ATF. FBI was not involved in most of the detonations. And we had 3 deaths and 23 people were injured. It ranged from having their fingers blown off to having shrapnel penetrate the body when they opened it with the device in their lap or on their desk. So pretty serious injuries from an explosion. I happen to know that because I was blown up in Vietnam and I had both legs broken. So the Unibomber worked for about 20 years. He was arrested in April of 1995. I became a postal inspector in 1981, and one of the first cases after I went through field training was doing the surveillance of a suspect at BYU who had been at Northwestern University and had transferred to BYU. At Northwestern, this student checked out the anarchist Bible, which showed how to make devices. And he had, his language was anti-government, and so he became a suspect. Someone probably tipped us off, and he became a suspect. And then there was a device placed in Salt Lake City, and BYU is in Provo, which is just south of that. We'll talk about that a little bit later too. So these are the devices that we're showing. This is another unique one that was delivered to a advertising executive. It's about the size of a book, a large book, and it's one of the devices that killed the ad executive. We'll go through that later. What happened? Okay. Okay, it all this started with 4 devices at Northwestern University in Chicago. And in May of 1978, this device was found on the grounds of the university, and let me catch up with myself for the notes so I can make sure. The device was found, and it was on the ground, but it had postage, over postage. This is $1 stamps, so making sure that it got delivered. It didn't require that much postage, and it was found by a collection box. So it was addressed with the return address of a professor at the university. So they took the bomb, or the device, the envelope, to the professor, and he said, I didn't make this, and I don't know who it's addressed to. So it became a suspicious device. The officer responding to the call, yes.
A question, when you said it was found by a collection?
Yeah, on the ground.
It would not fit in? Is that why it was found?
We suspect otherwise. So,
Really?
yes, because the return address was for someone at the University of Northwestern University, and it was going to somebody. So they took it to the professor who was supposedly from, and he said, I didn't do this, it's not from me. So they called the police. The officer who responded didn't heed the warning signs about suspicious devices, so he opened it. And it detonated, but it didn't injure him severely because it just made a flare and burned him. So the device, when it was opened, right here it says, lift this up. When it blew off, it just blew the cap off of the bomb, of the pipe. So it was not, I believe this was a electrical corrugated pipe, and he tried to solder it together with an end cap. So it just made a flare and fired off out there. So he wasn't injured badly. We recovered the whole wrapper. The police handled the case, and they didn't call postal inspectors until a month later. Oh, by the way, we found a piece of mail outside of the mail stream. In federal cases, this would not be a federal offense because it wasn't in the mail. It has to be in the mail before it becomes the jurisdiction of the federal government. This is a little bit out of post, but clearly there was a reward poster made for $1 million. Congress appropriated $1 million for the reward. We'll talk about that also later.
So each of those spots on the map were places the bombs were sent?
I beg your pardon?
Each of those spots that showed on the map?
Yes, they were all
He sent them
placed.
all over the country.
Yeah, he mailed most of his most of his devices were in large cities: Chicago, Salt Lake City, San Francisco, Sacramento, and they were either mailed or placed in those cities or mailed from those cities. Most of them were in Northern California with a return address. Some of them were not mail. A couple of them you'll see were road cones that were left in parking lots. This was one of the second devices that was placed, and it was went to a professor at the university, Northwestern University also, and it burned rather than exploded, and it injured the victim, burned his hands, and he was a astronaut candidate, and he wasn't able to go forward. He was a scientist. Then there was this device. American Airlines Flight 444 left Chicago bound for Washington, D.C. At 40,000 feet, a device detonated in the cargo hold of the aircraft, and it started a fire. It turned out to be a copper pipe bomb, and when it detonated, it blew the cap off and just made a flare that started a fire inside the whole of the aircraft. And it started burning all the mail, and it started making smoke in the cabin, and they made an emergency landing at Dulles, and everyone evacuated the plane. 12 people had smoke inhalation. They figured if the plane had been in the air another 5 minutes, they wouldn't have been able to land because the pilots were almost overcome as it was. So this was a pretty serious incident. They used a barometric switch, which is used in rocketry to make a second stage detonation for sending a rocket up. It's a simple device, $9. This is a little more sophisticated than the one that was used. This is a modern one. I don't have a photo of the other. This is the remnants of another device. This was mailed to the president of United Airlines at his home, and he received the device, and it was in the bomb was in a book that was hollowed out, and then the device was placed in the book. So when you open the book, it detonated, and it blew most of his hands apart. So he was injured pretty severely. And inside that device was a metal strip, and the initials FC were punched into that metal strip. And that became a signature item that was in many of the devices, which correlated the devices together at a later point in the investigation. Again, this was handled by the police, and the postal inspectors got involved because it was mail. And postal inspectors came on the scene after the police department did their investigation.
Are those initials or?
FC, we don't know. You'll see that later on the manuscript that the Unibomber sent to the newspapers, which is this manuscript. It's typed. It says by FC. So he was using that as a signature for his recognition that these different devices were from me, or from. Later on, he talked about, and he started writings, and he talked about we, so he tried to make it sound like it was a group. So FC became a signature thing that was in several devices, and you'll see later on that that's the case. And then this device was found in the university also by a bench. Someone started to pick it up and saw that there was a stick holding against the bench, and they left it. They called the Army EOD, and this was again by the University of Utah. This was in 1981 in October, and I happened to be in Denver in 1981 in October doing my training. So this happened while I was assigned to Salt Lake City, but I wasn't there. I was in training here in Denver. But the device was identified rightfully by as a suspicious device. The police were called, and then the police called the Army EOD to come, and they took the thing apart in a bathroom. One of the EOD guys went into the bathroom and took it apart, and so we were able to capture much of the device.
Could they determine what was going to be the trigger for that device?
They did, but I don't have notes exactly. This was probably just a release, a pressure switch. So when they took it apart, most of the time he had a place where on the device itself where he would say open or he have an arrow, and that was very typical. It was in a profile that I showed you of that package bomb. Often they would put personal, and then they might say open it right here. So if you do it dutifully as it says, the device will detonate the way he wanted it to, when he wanted it to. So that's handled by local police. Postal inspectors weren't involved, even though it was, again, addressed as mail, was outside the postal stream. So the police handled it. And none of these things came together at this point at all. These are different incidents. You know, bombs happen. And the postal inspectors quite often were called after the fact, maybe even up to a month later before we got involved. So we weren't able to get forensics. We weren't able to collect information. The postal inspectors have our own laboratory. FBI has a laboratory. Postals has a laboratory, and ATF, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, have their own laboratories for investigative purposes. And we have the same level of capability at each one of those three laboratories to do very scientific explorations of evidence, and handwriting is another part of it. The FBI difference is that they have profilers that actually evaluate conduct and psyche of a suspect. So then there's this device. It was mailed to Penn State, but the professor it was mailed to had moved to Vanderbilt. So they forwarded the device to Vanderbilt. And it arrived, the secretary for the professor opened the device and it was detonated, and she was seriously injured. It fit the profile. He had scratched out different things here, marked it up this way, and this is the forwarding by the Pennsylvania State College, Pennsylvania is not where Penn State is. It's at University Park, Pennsylvania. So these kind of misnomers are also part of the profiles that are for suspicious devices. So this was mail. Notice $3 worth of stamps for a lightweight parcel. It also was a copper pipe bomb. So it was and the return address was, the return address on it was good, but it wasn't, the person wasn't the one who prepared it. Then there were two devices that went in July of '82 to Corey Hall, and another one in May of '85 to Corey Hall also. In between there was another one that was mailed to Boeing in Seattle. So this device is number 8 because in between July and '82 and '85, this one arrived at Boeing, but it wasn't addressed properly, and it says it's to the fabrication department. There was no fabrication department, and so it sat on a shelf, and after 3 months, an engineer came in asked the mailroom guy, "What's this?" And he said, "Well, we don't know. Usually fabrications might be over in another." He said, "Well, I'll open it." So he tried to open it, and he found a box inside, a wooden box. And this is how he opened it. He used a ball-peen hammer. So he started pounding on it until he saw the pipe bomb inside and batteries along. So he called police eventually.
What kind of an engineer opens a box?
So this one was mail, and it was postal inspectors. We took this device out and detonated it and recovered the remains. But this is a live device at this point. They discovered that the batteries had died in the 3 months it sat on the shelf. It was the charge that was used to detonate, would have been used to detonate it, was a 9-volt battery. But they took the 9-volt battery apart, and inside a 9-volt battery are 9 1-volt batteries. And he had them in series so that they would lie flat and fit better into this box. And that was part of the reason that they shorted out during the period of time it sat on the shelf, because of the way they were wired together. So then in 1985, in November, we had this device in May of 1985. Then in November of 1985, this device arrives with the addressed to a professor. There was a letter attached to it that asked him to read the manuscript inside. These are 29-cent stamps, or these are 29-cent stamps, and these are dollar stamps. So over postage, and notice how neat the package is. If the larger device with, and the profile for the Unibomber case was basically very neat, lots of postage, and this filament tape, nylon filament tape, which is really hard to buy now. You can't, they've developed tape now. You can't buy this stuff unless you order it specially in the store. So he was very neat in using this filament tape on all sides, and that was part of the profile that we developed. My wife and I made, we had 3 different types of the envelope bomb, the large bomb, and then there was the third one was in that white box that I pointed out before. And those were the 3 profiles of the Unibomber. And we actually talked to postal employees who were carriers who picked up the mail at collection boxes, except for the large one that was mailed. The Postal Service didn't have any restrictions on the size for collection boxes, but obviously that big one didn't fit into the box. We don't know whether that was placed or where that was mailed. That device was totally consumed along with the victim when it detonated. So we don't have any of the remnants. We just know that it was about the size of a shoebox, and the carrier gave us that information. So this came with a letter lulling the person into opening the device, and it detonated.
Yeah, Doug?
Yeah.
If the postal employee handled the thing, it wouldn't detonate.
Right.
It was just a matter of whoever tried to open it.
Opening it, there was a pressure switch. When he released the, almost all of these boxes were either, except for the cigar box, were wooden boxes that he created. And some of the shrapnel inside was actually harvested from automobiles, pieces of molding, and I think one case it was a water pump that was broken up into pieces, and that was put in the device to make shrapnel. So they also, one of the monikers that the local police, they called him the junkyard bomber because of all these different parts. Wasn't the same. Sometimes you put nails in them, and so there was all the nails.
Did you ever figure out that by using the not using the metal, by using those copper pipes, that it wasn't as lethal? Did he ever figure that out?
Yeah, well, I think he was learning. And when he soldered this, he didn't use flux. So the solder, he soldered the edges, but then it wouldn't contain the expansion of the device when it exploded, so it blew the caps off, and that's when it created these fires. So then there's this device in Sacramento where a road sign was placed in the middle of a parking lot. And the owner of this computer store came out, moved the cone, and was killed when the device detonated. Not a mail case. Sacramento police was involved. FBI came and did some investigation on this. So it was not a postal case. Let's see, this was 11, okay. The next device was at a computer store. A road device was placed in the parking lot, similar to the one before. And the owner of this store came out to move it as well, and it detonated, and he was injured. The thing about this is there was an employee watching out the window when the device was placed in the parking lot. So he saw the suspect. The guy was in a hood and he was wearing sunglasses. And that's the result. The result of that was this drawing. This is an enhanced drawing. They drew it the first time and they went back to this victim several times to try to have them remember different parts, because she came and told them once that she remembered something else. And you see the similarities, especially to the nose and the mouth. But this was the profile that we had on posters and was published several times during the 20 years of the investigation. But this was the beginning in February of 1987. So that gave us this drawing. Then there was 7 years, nothing happened. We didn't receive any devices. We all went about our business. We had discussions, well, is he in prison? Is he dead? What went on, you know, and we had these disjointed investigations. So the inspectors had 2 or 3 cases that one of our inspectors kind of picked up, an inspector in Sacramento named Tony Moyet. He focused on it and it became he got possessed by this case his whole career, the rest of his career once he got involved in it. So he was handling the case, but for 7 years the guy disappeared. Tony got close to retirement. Then in 1993 he surfaced again and 2 devices were mailed. They were both envelopes like this. They were mailed to 2 computer professors, one in Tiburon and one in Tiburon, California, and one in Belvedere, California. But they were they weren't addressed properly, but they did get to the sender, and both of the senders opened the devices and were injured. Yes?
So I don't know if you ever figured out why the gap, but it's curious to me that when he starts up again, one of his targets is a
Professor?
is a geneticist.
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of curious when DNA came into use, because this is a brilliant guy. He must have thought about everything, and you've never apparently been able to find fingerprints.
The profilers at FBI did mention something about it, but I don't know the details of what that. It never did lead to any. We never were able to interview him at any point to get details. We did find a manuscript of each device that he created and the results. So the manuscript was written in code, in number code.
Research.
So it was very simple code to break because he just used numbers to replace letters. So but he had the whole manuscript, and he would make comments like, mailed this on this date, detonated, the fool opened it. That kind of comments in the manuscript. Yeah.
When he wrapped them, he had to have had gloves on because I suppose there were no fingerprints.
Oh, there were all kinds of things. Hairs were found under the envelopes, but we think they may have been, false information. So yeah, there were every kind of analysis. But again, remember, at this point, we had Salt Lake City Police, Chicago Police, ATF handled the couple of devices that were placed. Postal inspectors were involved. Nashville Police handled the case at Vanderbilt University. Berkeley Police handled the device at Corey Hall. Seattle Police handled the case in Seattle at Boeing. And then Sacramento Police were investigating the device there. So you had all these different agencies working independent cases, and they were not correlated. They ended up being correlated partly because of those FC that was discs that were metal. Many of them were just round pieces of metal with FC punched in them. Some were flat, but square like that one I showed you. But so all these different agencies at this point, after he started up again, were involved. Now the postal inspectors have 2 cases, and we start working that.
Question back here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember, I didn't follow the case, but I don't remember FC even being publicized.
It wasn't
So that was
publicized.
kept secret.
Yeah, no, that was never publicized. This case never went to trial. We never presented any of this evidence. He pled guilty to avoid the death penalty. So there was a lot of evidence to ultimately, you'll see. So the Tiburon devices, this is what was left that we were able to analyze, but it gave us these same clues, these same labels were used. We think they're probably from the same pack of labels, these red and blue labels. They come together and you separate them, or you can put them right together. So that was a profile issue also, the color of the labels. They're fairly common, but
Now,
still
you mentioned
unique.
The flag, the stamp
Yeah.
flags were-
That's a good point. You see that many of the devices had the flags with their stripes straight up in the air. We don't know why, but it was a profile issue, and the over postage, too much postage, and these flags were another element.
Question here. Stamps,
So, yeah,
when you buy stamps today, they are pre-pasted,
yes,
and when you pull them off, you put a portion of a fingerprint on the back.
yeah.
Was there ever any effort made to see if they could peel these and get fingerprints?
Yeah, we didn't have DNA evaluation back in those days. DNA. We didn't have the development of DNA back in the 25 years ago.
I'm talking about the fingerprint.
Oh well, yeah. Nothing was ever discovered of evidentiary value that way. What was the typewriter is unique. Typewriters like fingerprints because of the, especially in older typewriters where the typewriter is indenting as it types. With the newer typewriters that type over a tape, then the tape takes on that, and it doesn't. They don't get damaged as much as the old typewriters, where they might get a dent in a corner of a letter from some use. In this case, it was a Corona typewriter, a portable typewriter that was used to type this, and they could tell that by the font that was used and the spacing. And ultimately, when David gave us his name, he also told us that his mother sent him a Corona typewriter. So a typewriter was something that was in the search warrant ultimately that was used. So typing was, the same labels were used. Same typewriter was used, and then the different types of stamps were unique. The purple stamp that's on there, the dollar stamps, are Eugene O'Neill stamps, which that became another profile issue. So this is what we had to look as the remnants, and you notice that in these devices were screws that injured the victims more. Then devices, the same day that those other two devices were mailed, this was mailed to the New York Times. This was a letter saying, we're going to continue bombing, and it was a kind of a threatening letter. But on that letter, when you have two pieces of paper and you write on top of a piece of paper, there's something called indented writings. So you make, with a pencil perhaps, you write on the one piece of paper, but then the piece underneath takes the impression of the point of the pencil or pen and records that, and with magnetic powder they can develop that underwriting issue, which is what was discovered was Nathan R. was imprinted on this piece of paper. So we didn't know who Nathan R. was, and that became an idea. In that letter it also mentioned Andrew Gillespie, and it gave us a secret code which was FC, and that from the future any device would be, anything with FC on it would be indicated from this mailer. And this is, by this time, see, the task force was created. So the task force was created in 1993 when this letter was received. We find the agencies during a training session, I think at Red Sands or at one of the bomb EOD training centers, several of the investigators that were involved in the different cases said, I had this kind of situation and we found this little piece of metal. They started putting it together and they decided to create the Unibomber task force and evaluating all of the different people that were involved in the investigation. They created the Unibomber task force in San Francisco with the FBI as the lead agency. So the supervisor in charge of FBI, John Freeman, was and my boss, Don Davis, and ATF agent Brian, I don't remember Brian's last name. So the three agencies formed the task force, and they were the three leaders of the task force. Then each agency contributed a number of agents to work the case in the FBI office in San Francisco, and that became known as the FBI Unibomber Task Force. I wasn't on the task force. I was a supervisor for mail security in San Francisco, but I was a supervisor, and I had to give up two of my guys to go on that task force, and then I just supported them. Eventually I became, after this letter was received, we created a task force to try and identify, or have our postal employees be able to identify the devices with the profile we had developed. So I made 10 of each of these type of devices up as mock-ups and had them addressed exactly the way they were on the suspect devices. And our purpose was to go to all postal employees in Northern California, because that's where most of the devices were mailed, and educate all of the postal employees on all tours, 3 tours. They worked 24 hours a day in the post office. So we had FBI agent and a postal inspector went to every office in the Northern California and showed these mock-ups to them, gave them a briefing of what to look for, the tape, the type of letters, the labels, and we were hopeful of being able to capture a device the next time it was mailed. So I was in charge of that program. I became involved as the parcel expert for the Unibomer investigation, and then I prepared all the evidence for presentation at trial. We ended up not going to trial, but so that's why I've got some of these things. These are ones I just made up. The ones I had originally made up after 20 years are pretty worn after I've made these kind of presentations. So then there was this device. This is the first device that under the Unibomber task force. This was that white box that I showed you. It was about the size of a book. It was mailed to an ad executive in New Jersey, and he opened it in his kitchen, and he was killed by the device. The carrier who delivered it went out on disability because he saw how heavy it was, and he mentally thought that it was unusual and suspicious, but he didn't say anything. And he kind of suffered from that after the fact. And we made it worse later with another incident that I'll maybe, I might be able to get to it. Are we too long here?
Just keep going.
About an hour.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Then on the day after the Oklahoma bombing at the federal building at Alfred P. Murray, this device was mailed to Sacramento. It was mailed to the president of the California Forestry Association, and his name was listed, but he had retired, and the new president was in, and his name was different. Secretary picked up this device, the box, and she brought it into his office, and she said, "This is very suspicious. It's way too heavy. She said, "If you're going to open that, I'm leaving." And she left the room. He opened it, and he was almost disintegrated by the device. It was 9 pounds of black powder, and it created a 5-foot hole behind this dais. So it was the worst bomb the biggest and most destructive bomb that he had created. It was bomb number 16, and luckily it was the last bomb.
How many pounds of black powder?
9.
9 pounds. Wow.
Yeah. So I just know it was able to make that, it destroyed the office for sure. So in 1995, the Unibomber sent his manuscript to the New York Times and demanded that it be published, and that if it was published, he would not send any more bombs. So there was a lot of discussion with the Department of Justice and the FBI and all the investigators about whether to publish it or not. If you give in to him, he might make other demands. So it ultimately turned out that they did publish it. That broke the case. David Kaczynski, Ted's brother, reported that the writings in the manuscript were the same kind of writings that he received from his brother over time. And
Now, was that stylistic or was it subject matter opinions?
both. It was actual phrases. He had a phrase something like, "You can't have your cake and eat it too," but he said you can't eat your cake and have it too. And he said it backwards in the letters to his parents and to his brother, and he said it backwards in the manuscript. But that's circumstantial evidence. So the FBI was, we found out where he was. He was in Lincoln, Montana. This is him as a professor at Berkeley. His mailbox. He rode in back and forth over the time he lived up in Lincoln on a bicycle into town. He was a known weird guy with all, he was weird looking, as you'll see in this photo. He lived in this cabin up in Lincoln, Montana on an acre and a half of his own. He bought the property and then he and his brother built the cabin.
Question?
Yes.
All of the implements that he put into the bombs, did he buy those locally?
Yep. Yep. In Montana, you can buy dynamite and make your own, buy ammunition and take the heads off and pour black powder in, or you can buy black powder in a 10 count tin. So
For reloaders.
yeah, well that and just it's all available out in that part of the country.
In that small town he was living there.
Yeah, and the car parts where there was junk cars all around this area in the logging area. So for about 3 weeks, FBI agents, postal inspectors, and the task force was up surveilling this cabin, getting prepared to try and interface with, they were trying to get an arrest warrant, but they didn't have probable cause. So they got a search warrant. They went up and confronted him, took him into custody and moved him to another cabin, interviewed him. And while they were interviewing, the FBI searched the cabin. He had a basement that he had dug about 3.5 feet deep in below the cabin, and it was straw down there, and that's where he built the devices. There they found a live device. So it was prepared for mailing. They left the cabin, called EOD in, and they arrested him based on that possession of that device. So this is the interior of his cabin. It was an interesting case because we didn't have I wasn't there. The FBI and postals were there. They didn't have an arrest warrant. They did discover the device, but it's still, they decided to call the local sheriff, and based on the sheriff seeing the bomb, the sheriff made the arrest of the Unibomber. The FBI and postal went back to Montana and got a complaint and filed the complaint against the Unibomber in federal court. But we had originally the sheriff arrested Ted. So Kaczynski was pled guilty to avoid the death penalty. He was given 4 life sentences, which meant life without the possibility of parole. He lived at Supermax here in Colorado until December of last year. And this is the evidence that we could have used against him, including the manuscript that listed all the devices for us and the results of the bombings. So he pled guilty. This is Supermax down in southern Colorado. In December, and this is his cell. It's 7 feet by 10 feet. And he was in this, yeah. He was in this cell 23 hours a day. He had 1 hour a day exercise. This is Ted in federal prison.
You should have been executed.
In December, he was transferred to the U.S. prison, federal prison in North Carolina. He was sent to the medical facility here with some serious illness, we don't know. So that's where he's living right now.
Doug, when he was arrested, was he charged under state law and also federal?
Initially, he was arrested just under state jurisdiction, and then a federal complaint was.
In a federal case?
Yes, it was a federal case. Actually,
You said you were going to talk about the death penalty.
the what?
You said you were going to talk about the death penalty.
Oh yeah, it was four life sentences. He pled guilty because the death penalty was law at the time of his arrest. That was changed in 2021. The death penalty is no longer available in federal cases. Congress changed the law. But back then, Janet Reno authorized the death penalty. He had lawyers, and they told him, we have this, you're not going to win your case, you're going to be executed. And he decided to plead guilty. So there was no trial, no presentation of all this evidence, but we had it as backup.
Where was the trial to take place? Where was it?
Sacramento was the jurisdiction, because that was the last device. Actually, the jurisdiction could have been any place that we had a federal case. The placed bombs were best local cases, even though ATF was involved, which is a federal agency. Because they were in the local jurisdiction, they weren't really considered. But he got 4 life sentences, and that means he's not ever getting out. Yeah.
I noticed you've been very careful not to say very much about the victims. Would it be appropriate now to mention one of our more local victims? That's Professor John Hauser at the University of Colorado in Boulder.
Do you know him, or do you know the results of
Crossed
the?
paths with the
Is
gentleman.
he injured in his hands or what?
Yes.
Yeah.
Professor Hauser attended the University of California, Berkeley.
Right.
At the same time that Kaczynski was teaching math there. And Ted Kaczynski placed a kind of an innocuous box on a shelf at the university. And John Hauser at that time was the United States Air Force captain. He was on active duty working toward his PhD, and he had 1,500 hours of jet time, and his aspirations were to be an astronaut.
Another one.
So John Hauser opened the box and lost most of his hand and arm.
Yeah.
And then later on, he obtained a professorship at the university, and he taught at Boulder. And I met the gentleman a couple times when I used to fly a little bit at the Boulder Airport, and there was a facility there called Dakota Ridge, and they had a Super Cup, and John Hauser used to come out, and he wore his Air Force jacket with patches all and everything, and he would fly that airplane, and so I.
Thank you for that. I didn't know the details of that, but I had heard there was another astronaut.
Yeah, but that was 30 years ago. I was wondering if there's any
Sure.
an update.
Yeah, no, I don't have any details about that. I didn't know he was even local. Yeah.
There's been several indications that this man was very intelligent. Even myself, I know that, you could buy a piece of lead pipe and put the caps on it, they make pretty good pipe bombs. Do you think that he used these copper bombs at first because he really didn't intend to kill people but was just trying to make a statement? Or do you think he just wasn't that smart?
No, I think he was that smart, but the airline incident tells me that he wanted to kill everybody in that plane, and that was his goal. So I think that he was just not very adept at soldering. He wasn't good at soldering. He didn't use flux on the pipes, so those first few pipes, the end caps came off. Of course, he tested them out in the woods. Evidently, there were people reported, explosions happening. So he may have tested them out in the woods, but he still was not successful until after 3 or 4 bombs.
If I could add one more thing, I was just down at an old fort in Key West, and they have an 8-inch Columbiad cannon there that fires an 8-inch iron ball, and he mentioned 9 pounds of black powder in this bomb. That 8-inch Columbiad uses 10 pounds of powder, and it can propel an 8-inch iron ball 2 miles.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty good sized explosion.
You bet. Yeah. Yes.
I'm curious because you said the brother helped him build that cabin.
Yeah.
So was the family, was there interaction through the 20 years that he was doing all of this?
Yes, they sent him money.
The money was the other question.
Yeah,
I had, is how was
he
funding this?
His brother gave him money mostly. He didn't like his parents. He resented his parents because they were very strict when he was young. They got him into Harvard at 16, so they they did support him because they had to pay for it. But he didn't like his parents. And so his mother she sent typewriters, she sent him support, but his brother mainly supported him. So,
What the
yeah.
family's attitude about him, just that he was a crazy
Yeah,
eccentric and they
yeah, all of his writings, they just, Ted is crazy, you know.
What did his brother do?
He runs a nonprofit, something like, I just was looking that up just last night. He ran a nonprofit like a homeless, helping the homeless, or I'm not sure if it's homeless but he's helping. He has a foundation. He got the $2 million reward, and he wanted to keep some of the money for the foundation he was running, and he had to pay taxes on the $1 million, so taxes came out probably 20%. But he gave most of the money that he got from that reward to the victims. At least he stated that he wanted the victims to have it. There's no follow-up that I could find that documented that they actually got the money, but that was his intent, is to give the money to the victims. I think he felt guilty for his brother. Yeah.
Did they find out what FC meant?
No. He never consented to an interview with law enforcement at all. He was interviewed by one newspaper person, and he wasn't very much revealing in that. He was the main thing he wanted to have noticed was that he's not crazy, and that was his worry, that people would, for some reason, he wanted to protect that. So most of the interview was about him not being crazy. Yes.
Well, a psychopath has no remorse. That is one thing that marks a psychopath.
Yep, that's what we would say he is. He developed a relationship in writing with a woman. While he was in prison, they were thinking of getting married. This happens a lot. He had a lot of fans, female fans, writing to him. It happens with all of our major murder suspects. He had this relationship. He changed. He became a little more simple. He became a little more social, and especially with her. They wrote a lot. They were planning to get married, but she died of cancer. And you see him smiling in the pictures. So he was more social after being in prison for a while. So there was a change in his psyche. He did write, while he was in prison, he wrote 2 books that were published, but they're just reiterations of his manuscript. So he wrote 2 books. I don't think he was able to benefit from the income of this, and I think that he gave the money to one of the universities. And all of his writings, I think, are at Northwestern University. He donated all of his writings, which, like, over the years he was in prison, and there's something like 2,000 documents or something that some graduate students are researching now. So he's an unusual cat, and I had the pleasure of working on the case. So.
Doug, thank you so much for being our speaker, and want
Thank
to
you.
give you one of our
Oh, good.
mugs.
That's a nice thing. And this museum is worth supporting, I can tell you that. If you have time later today, take a walk around if you haven't done so already. So, and you're welcome to come up. I'll stay here for a little bit if you want to look at any of this stuff. Yeah.